You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 38. Despite the sprite's veiled threat, Karyne still didn't unsheath his sword. Thankfully, Riverin took his cue from Karyne, maintaining a defensive stance. Sprites weren't known for being combative, just tricky. He tried not to grimace at the creature's oddly human form, limbs all curled in like a corpse's. It blinked down at him, leaving behind a sticky-looking residue over its large black eyes. "We apologize for intruding," Karyne inclined his head. "We'll take our leave."
"Leave? But you just got here."
The sprite's tone held a childlike pout.
"You haven't even made a request."
Karyne hesitated. At one time, he'd wanted their help finding Daisy. A part of him still did. It burned to have so many obstacles when he was so close to finding her. Maybe they could help the process along, guarantee his success.
"I thought so. What is it you seek?"
"No, Karyne." Riverin backed away toward the cave entrance, beckoning for Karyne to follow. The sprite glanced at Riverin, taking in the X on his forehead with mild curiosity. Then it turned more fully toward Karyne, as if Riverin no longer mattered.
"Go on. Tell me."
Karyne's mind raced, visions of both Daisy and the cutlass warring with common sense. Sprites couldn't be trusted. He reached out, tuning in to the sprite's memories, hoping for a hint of what happened to Daisy when she was here. But he met a wall as blank as the one in Aura's mind. The sprites had power to give him Daisy or the cutlass. If he was being honest, he wanted to cross the barriers, to see the world, to make it bigger like Aura had suggested. Enla wanted to unite the Vendarans, but what if they could connect with the Lorvondans or Salines? What if they could learn from the Amranans and Devlonians? What if they could unite all of Riston? He let his request roll around in his head, dissecting it until he felt sure the sprites couldn't turn it against him. "I want to cross the barriers with Daisy," he said. The sprite blinked again, the residue disappearing. It studied him for so long he wondered if it hadn't heard, or if he hadn't heard its reply. Finally, the sprite cocked its head.
"Unless you also seek an early grave, you will take her across a barrier in your lifetime."
A rush of elation swept through Karyne, but he held it in, waiting for the catch, for details, for the cost. But nothing more came. That's it? The sprite's head tilted the other way as it blinked again, the cloudy film making Karyne cringe.
"Is that not what you seek?"
How will I cross? And what is the price for your assistance?" Riverin shook his head slightly, a warning in his eyes.
"We are not assisting you. It was already foretold."
Karyne let the sprite's words run through his mind again. Gaining access in his lifetime could mean 40 years from now. Was this one of their tricks? "Foretold for when? I want to protect her now." He glanced at Riverin. Who knew how he'd interpret this request? Sun's fire, he wished he'd been able to come alone. "I want to cross the barriers to protect her and unite all of Riston." Riverin stiffened beside him, but Karyne kept his eyes on the sprite, watching for any response.
"Then you want to start a war."
The words sounded cold and emotionless, but Karyne detected a hint of morbid interest. What? No, I just want to make the world bigger. He winced, not sure if the sprites would see that the same way Aura did. A strange, tinkling sound filled the cavern as the sprite reared its head back. Was it laughing?
Assistance will be granted, but the cost will be high.
Don't. Riveren's hand gripped Karyne's arm, but he shook the other man off. What's the price? The creature ignored his question.
You expected to find the cutlass. It's not here. A woman took it long ago, gave it to her husband. It's a relic that's been passed on from collector to collector, each oblivious to its true value.
Another blink, and the film disappeared.
You're better off finding the fish first.
Fish? Karyne frowned, pulling out the book and flipping to the handwritten notes. He studied the symbols again. There was a sword, an arrow, a circle, and an oval with a triangle. There wasn't any fish, unless... He squinted at the oval and triangle, seeing how together they might make a fish. It even looked like there might have been a dot off-center in the circle, representing an eye. And next to the symbol was the question, saline? His heart pounded so hard it felt like his starlock bounced against his chest with the reverberation. What if each starbridge was assigned its own land? The arrow took Daisy to and from Lorvandus. The cutlass and whatever the circle represented would take someone to Amranus and Devlon, which meant the fish would take them to Selah Island. Where is the fish? The sprite cocked its head once more, analyzing Karyne like a calculative predator.
If you take the opportunity to cross the barriers, you will lose much. Enla will lose more.
No, Riveren whispered. Karyne took a step back. Why Enla? The sprite blinked, and the residue returned.
A fisherman in Andel has the fish. He doesn't know what he holds. He mounted it on the wall of his ship's cabin, along with the hide of—
Stop! Riveren flung himself between Karyne and the sprite, daggers out, but not to defend against the sprite. His crouched stance and narrowed eyes faced Karyne, ready for the offensive.
You can't play with people's lives. It's not your right to decide what Enla will lose. What if she loses her life? It's too high a price.
Karyne hesitated. Riveren put a voice to his own concerns and fears, but they hadn't said she'd lose her life. What if they meant she'd lose her brother? Or her throne? If the recreants got their way, Karyne might need the Starbridges to take Enla to safety too.
She forfeited her life the moment she aligned with Mavis. Crossing the barrier won't change that.
Every nerve in Karyne's body tingled with the sprite's words. She's not aligned with Mavis. Though as he said the words, he recalled Enla's talk of confirming Mavis's spiritual authority. Had the dignitaries already come? Was Enla already in danger? The sprite lifted a shoulder.
Believe what you wish.
Karyne's hand twitched, brushing the handle of his sword. The fluttering of the sprite's wings intensified, drawing attention to movement around the perimeter of the room. A dozen or so other sprites came out of the shadows, all varying shades of green in the algae's light.
They can't be trusted.
Riveren inched toward Karyne, forcing him to step back.
We need to leave. You don't want to owe them anything. The price they're extracting is too high. It's not high enough. It's practically a gift.
Karyne licked his lips, his mind racing as the other sprites crowded in. Riveren shifted his stance, no longer facing Karyne but the sprites that were hemming them in. If Enla's life is forfeit, and crossing the barrier can't change it, what can? Karyne asked. The sprites all paused in their advance.
You have a different request?
The one he'd been speaking to shifted, its face bulging as if it had cheeks for a smile.
Usually these sorts of deals require one life for another.
Riverin shook his head so violently his neck cricked.
No, we need to go. Now.
He shifted both daggers to one hand like the X on his forehead and used his free hand to yank on Garen's arm, but Garen held his ground. How does it work? Whenever she would have died, I die in her place? The sprite bent in close, and both men held their breath, their fear reflecting back at them from the shiny, bulbous eyes.
Something like that. It appears he does seek an early grave.
The second, higher voice came from behind them, and both men turned. It was impossible to tell which of the new sprites had spoken.
So much for crossing the barrier. This is my deal.
The first sprite's voice rose while it fluttered around the men, as if shielding them from the others. Then it turned to face them once more.
Which will it be?
Garen shrank back, realizing the question was directed at him.
Your life for Enla's? Or access across the barrier at a high cost to Enla?
It wasn't much of a decision when the sprite put it that way.
Neither,
Riverin said, dragging Garen around the sprite's side, but the sprite shifted, hovering in their way.
Neither is no longer an option.
Its wings beat faster, and the other sprites came even closer, the sound of all their wings almost deafening as it echoed through the cave. If Garen didn't take a deal, he and Riverin wouldn't leave the cave alive. Besides, he had to protect Enla. She would always come first. Take my life for Enla's, Garen said. The sprite's cheeks rose again, making Garen wonder how a smile without a mouth could feel so sinister.
So be— No!
Riverin lunged, driving his dagger into the sprite's chest. Its wings faltered, dropping it a foot, then another. Squeals erupted around the room, like pigs being slaughtered. When the sprite finally fell, the color drained from its skin, starting at the tips of its wings and appendages and ending at the center of its chest, where the dagger still rested, drawing life from the creature's body. Garen unsheathed his sword and cast a furtive glance at the other sprites, but all their eyes rested on the dying sprite, their wails of mourning still echoing off the cave's walls. The sprites were so caught up in their grief that it was like Garen and Riverin no longer existed. This time Garen was the one to tug on Riverin's sleeve, pulling the other man from his shock. They slipped between two sprites, and Garen was surprised at the tears tracking down the creatures' faces. As they rushed to the cave's exit, a hiss erupted from behind them, like steam being loosed from a valve. Garen turned, and despite the algae being the only source of light, a clearly defined blackness rose from the now dead sprite, the stretching of a soul, filling the room and blocking their view of the remaining sprites. It swept past them, through them, taking the exit before them, stealing their courage along with it. It left Garen's chest cold and his fears magnified, and when the blackness abated, a dozen pairs of livid eyes focused their filmy gazes on him. As one, Riverin and Garen turned, running through the tunnel. Garen hoped the creature's wings would hamper their progress. Screeches exploded from behind them, the echo making it impossible to tell how close they were. At any moment, Garen expected a claw on his shoulder, a yank on his foot. Maybe this was how it had gone for Daisy. Maybe the sprites were just waiting for Riverin and Garen to reach the mouth of the cave so they could push them off the edge. He reached out, tuning into the mind of the closest sprite. The memories were a blank wall, just like the others had been, but its mind buzzed, like the hive mind of a colony of bees. The gravel Karyne had hardly noticed beneath his feet on the way in now felt like a slippery death trap. When Karyne skidded, Riverin practically lifted him off the ground with one hand to right him. A glance back proved they'd made some ground, but the shrieks confirmed it wasn't enough. What would happen when they left the cave? Surely the sprites could fly faster than the men could run. When the space widened again and distant moonlight lit the way, Karyne's hope momentarily soared. Except the sprites could now use their wings more easily. This time, when Karyne turned, a deep orange sprite barreled down on him, hands spread with talons extended. Karyne stumbled, falling on his hip, then backside, and before he could right himself, the sprite's claws raked across his chest. The pain didn't come at first, but it quickly turned to a debilitating burn, like acid that ate at the edges, then sank deeper and deeper. By now, Riverin was dragging him out the cave's opening, the dozen sprites still bearing down on them. As a rainbow of arms and claws reached out for Karyne, Riverin mumbled, "Sorry, friend." The ground flew out from under Karyne as Riverin yanked him up. Before Karyne could get his bearings, the other man's arms were wrapped around him, pulling him over the edge. Together, they choked on water as they fell.
Chapter 39. "Do you ever get the feeling that we're being followed?" Cyrus asked, glancing over his shoulder. After a week of riding through rainforest, they were finally sloping down toward the grasslands. "Or watched?" Eliana tried to follow his gaze as she redid her braid while atop her horse. They were at the back of the pack with Lukai, and Eliana only saw trees and the setting sun behind them. "Silmar's always watching me," she said, "like I'm going to sprout wings one morning." "No, I mean over the last week." Eliana glanced at Cyrus. Worry pinched the skin between his eyes. "Ever since Lover's Falls?" Lukai asked. "Exactly." "No." Eliana tied off her braid, flinging it back over her shoulder. "No one's following us. It's the dark spirits. Once you've seen them, they plague you. They can be hundreds of miles away, and it will feel like they're around every corner." Cyrus hummed his disagreement. "I don't think they're interested in me. I don't have star blood." Eliana squirmed at the twinge of jealousy inside her. She wished she didn't have any star blood to interest the dark spirits either. "Interesting." Lukai tapped his lips. "That actually gives me an idea for Eliana's training." Eliana winced as he nudged his gelding ahead to catch up with Silmar. The last several nights had been filled with theoretical and mental exercises from Silmar, followed by hands-on physical training with Lukai, both of which came after archery with Cyrus. She reached her arms overhead, stretching out sore muscles. "We'll stop here for the night," Silmar called out from ahead. "Starting tomorrow, we'll be more exposed in the grasslands. This part of the country is still feeling the bite of winter." Eliana and half of the others were already sliding off their mounts, eager for the day of riding to be done. This was the hardest part of the day for her, when the buildup of her blood was most painful. Silmar had made it clear that weaning would take weeks, but it was getting more manageable with each day. Manageable didn't erase the panic and fear. She still scanned the skies, still tried to hide her scars. Guilt still plagued her no matter how many times the others reassured her she was doing nothing wrong. She wasn't sure if it was possible to unlearn those reactions. She wasn't sure she wanted to get comfortable enough to unlearn them. Not when she could slip back into blood magic. Ready to practice? Cyrus offered her the white bow and quiver in exchange for her horse's reins. Even after the day's ride, her arms itched to hold the bow, but the others pulled packs off horses and began setting up camp. We should at least help with the bedrolls first. Your job is to train. Silmar stepped between them, taking her horse's reins. What happened to your arm? She glanced down at the bruise and cut on her forearm. I'm not sure. I've always bruised easily. I never seem to remember what I bump into. Or what cuts you? He reached out a hand as if he might touch the scab, and she jerked away. I didn't cut myself. Her words came out defensive, far more likely to sound like a lie, even though they were true. Silmar's eyebrows rose. That's not what I was suggesting. He paused, holding her gaze. Eliana forced herself to do the same, even though shame coursed through her. After you're weaned, we can add you into the rotation for chores. He led the mare to a small clearing where the other mounts were tied. Eliana took the bow and quiver from Cyrus, and, despite Silmar's probing, she smiled as she slid her hands over the smooth, curved wood. As painful as this time of day was, it was also becoming one of her favorites. She wound her way through the eastern side of their temporary camp until the trees thinned and the edge of the grassy plains could be seen. She'd had to make do with shorter distances because of the rainforest's wild growth. But now she'd be able to practice longer ranges, challenging her skills, or really, her magic. A breeze lifted her hair, the coolness stealing her breath. Deep in the thick, humid forest, she'd forgotten that it was winter, that back in Galdrick Valley, spring would soon be announcing its return. But the higher they rose in elevation, and the farther they got from the rainforests, the more the seasons would be apparent. Choosing a tree as her mark, she pulled an arrow from her quiver and readied her bow. Her first shot hit the exact knot she'd been aiming for, at least 20 paces away. After several days of training, she could pull energy from her starlock without blood, and she could move the energy some, even if it was just to put more force behind her arrows. Now Silmar wanted her honing in on her senses, making slight adjustments to heighten her awareness of the sounds, smells, and movements around her. It felt impossible. But a week ago, she had said the same about pushing her energy out without blood. Now she felt like she had a loose hold on her energy levels, an awareness of when it was becoming too much and how to lighten the load. I'll miss the rainforest, Cyrus said, coming up behind her with his bow. She let off a second shot, this time hitting the mark from 30 feet. Her starlock warmed its approval. I'm guessing you'll like Islara too, Eliana said. Silmar said it has pine and oak trees, fields of crops as far as the eye can see, a valley surrounded by majestic mountains. Sounds a bit like Galdrick Valley. Cyrus's wistful tone made Eliana pine for something else, a sense of belonging, a family to make a place feel like home. She grabbed another arrow. We'll get you back home with Bartholom. She stumbled a bit over his grandfather's name, wanting to tag on his grandmother's name too. But Della wouldn't be waiting for him to return. After we get you to your mother, he said. Somehow, I think you need her as much as she needs you, and far more than I need to return to Lorvandus. The priest in him found ways to see straight to her core. What might have been unnerving was more of a relief. Having him understand without having to explain was so much easier. Besides, he added, if the stars intend for me to return, I will. She raised her arrow against her cheek. Save that discussion for my training session with Silmar. I like seeing him get worked up over your theology. Her arrow missed its mark, a testament to her lack of focus, rather than a weakness in her magic. Cyrus chuckled. Jasperus gets adamant about it, too. Tried telling me about a book called The Sins of the Stars. The title alone is so blasphemous, I have trouble imagining what words it might contain. Veldin told me it's their version of the Great Divide, Eliana said. Says it explains how the stars went against the sun's wishes by dividing the lands and putting up the barriers. That they thought it was for our good, but really it was their pride. They thought they knew better than the sun. Cyrus shuddered. I find that scarier than those dark spirits of yours. Eliana grimaced as she let loose another arrow. They continued while the others set up camp, and before long, Holm and Veldin came back with an antelope they'd shot in the grasslands. It was the largest thing they'd hunted since the journey had begun, and Eliana couldn't take her eyes off the way it lay at an odd angle when Holm set it down by the fire, how the breeze ruffled the tuft of hair at its throat. Holm placed a hand on the antelope's flank, then surprised Eliana by reciting some sort of prayer or blessing. We thank the sun for your sacrifice. You were blessed with life, and now you bless us with life. May the sun's light always shine upon you. He paused for a moment, then patted the flank once more before pulling out his knife. Eliana turned away, catching sight of Cyrus's wrinkled brow. He'd spent so many nights out worshipping the stars, while the Vindarans often said a quick prayer to the sun when they rose. She tilted her face toward the sun, which now hung low, nearly ready to sleep. She sensed it energizing her blood, her starlock. She could understand why the Vindarans, especially the progenies, worshipped the sun. While growing up, Eliana's trips to the stargazers had become fewer and fewer as Arvid and Vera had tightened their hold. Still, she'd grown to love the stars, even if she didn't understand why they would create things and people so bent on destruction. But it hadn't been her way of life like it had been for Cyrus. She didn't mind if the Vindarans served a different creator. It was how her parents would have raised her, and that alone was something she wanted to respect. Holm and Kendallin made quick work of skinning the antelope and dividing up the meat to cook. Lukai raised his eyebrows and beckoned to Eliana. The scent of food cooking was quickly becoming her cue for more training. They settled at the edge of camp, where Lukai brought her through the same exercises Silmar usually did, enhancing senses, pushing and pulling energy in and out of the starlock. The repetitive skills calmed her, putting her back in a better frame of mind. The chirps and chittering in the trees around her grew louder even without her enhanced senses, as the sun slid beneath the canopy of trees. Healing is simply taking things a step further, Lukai said. They sat on a bed of grass and leaves so thick that Eliana was unable to tell if the trees had shed or if vines grew along the forest floor. Instead of enhancing your senses, You enhance your awareness and understanding. As you become aware of what's wrong with a person's body, you can adjust it. Sometimes it takes the smallest of tweaks, a simple push or pull of the energy around it. Sometimes it's more like a yank or a shove. Think of it like bringing scales back into balance. She nodded, even though his words sounded too theoretical to actually apply. Cyrus, Lukai called over his shoulder. Eliana straightened. With her senses still heightened, she became acutely aware of her heart's increased rate. Cyrus grinned as he sat next to them, rubbing his hands together. Am I getting boils? A fever? A broken bone? Eliana grimaced. A cut. With the flick of his wrist, Lukai pulled out his knife and made the slightest cut on Cyrus's finger. It was more like a needle prick than anything else, but still, Eliana gasped. I told Silmar no cutting. Her words came out on a growl. I don't even feel it, Cyrus reassured her. No. Eliana moved to stand, but Lukai grabbed her wrist. For a moment, panic wove through her, but his touch was gentle as he kept her by his side. I will not torture him. I will not cut him in the ways you've been cut over the years. His hand moved to slide over her scars, and she couldn't stop the shiver that came at his touch. But he's the best person for you to practice this type of injury on. You're still weaning from the buildup of magic in your system, but there's more to it than that. Starblood draws you to use it because that's how you were trained. Any time Starblood is drawn, you'll sense its pull. She yanked her hand away from Lukai's and glanced at Cyrus's finger. A tiny drop of blood beaded up around the broken skin. It didn't call to her the way her own had. Instead, there was a tug, a desire to find blood she could use. This was the idea he'd gotten from their discussion earlier. To maim Cyrus because he didn't have Starblood to tempt her. When you need to heal a half-light, you won't have time to wonder if you're using the magic in their blood or in your Starlock. If you start developing your opposite spoke, you'll have the same problem in battle with the Zealots. My opposite spoke? Healing falls on the constructive somatic spoke. You'll continue to develop that skill, but strengthening it will also open up the possibility for you to mirror that skill. It's how Silmar is able to do minimal healing, even though he's a destructive somatic. And I can injure, not like Silmar can, but enough for it to be an advantage in a fight. Kendallin can sift through the lies of someone's past, understand the drive behind their actions, but she can also see a bit of the truth. It's like the wheel's way of finding balance as your abilities grow. Eliana squirmed. I don't want to learn to injure other people. Lukai leaned to the side, bringing his face into her line of vision. That's fine. For now, we're focusing on healing without blood magic. If we start with Cyrus, we'll know you're not using blood magic. Then we can work our way up. She nodded, hating that he was right. If she was ever going to be of any use to this group, she had to get past this. Cyrus held out his finger, and Eliana placed a shaking hand over his palm. She closed her eyes. Start by enhancing your senses, Lukai whispered, his breath hitting her ear in a distracting way as he leaned forward to watch. Feel where his blood pulses, where the smallest parts of his body work. Do you sense the brokenness? She reached, pushing the slightest bit of energy from her blood through Cyrus's hand, its power tracing through to his finger, where there was a dissonance. "Yes," she whispered. Without further instruction, she sensed the need to make it right, to adjust the wrongness. It was different from the time they'd tested her, when the need had been more of a feeling. Now it was like the need was a guide. She pushed her energy through his hand more, urging the broken parts to mend, the misaligned areas to weave together. Cyrus inhaled sharply, and Eliana opened her eyes. The drop of blood remained, but Cyrus wiped it away, revealing the tiniest of scars, like a newly healed wound. "Perfect." Lukai grinned, running his finger over Cyrus's to remove the scar. "At this rate, we can practice a dozen more times before Kendallen's done burning the meat." I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might enjoy listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where Paeter and I narrate fantasy short stories from a variety of authors to help you find your next favorite author. Check it out at findingfantasyreads.com. Thanks so much for listening.